welcome everyone to our program on China's Rise and the American Response, featuring perspectives from KEI's latest volume of the Joint U.S.-Korea Academic Studies series that we have. I know there will be a lot of great takeaways from our discussion, but we also hope that today's webinar proves to be a pathway for you to explore the rest of the book, which has a total of 14 chapters across 3 sections. If you're not familiar with the series, each volume has a set of 3 or 4 sections, with each section pursuing different themes in geopolitics, national identity, and economics across the Indo-Pacific region. Within each section, we have individual authors explore the theme from the perspective of various countries across the region in order to give the reader a more comprehensive view of major ongoing developments in the region. Not only do the chapters within each section of this year's volume complement each other very well, but so too do the chapters across the entirety of the book, which you'll see shortly. Each of our presenters wrote a chapter for a different section of our Joint U.S.-Korea Academic Studies volume, all addressing the same issue of the U.S.-China rivalry in some way, but from a different angle. The competition between Beijing and Washington has, of course, been the key issue for the U.S. and its allies in Asia for the past few years, and indeed, the pandemic has ensured that it will only get more important. The book, as well as the individual chapters, can all be found on our website, keia.org. But now I'll turn things over to I'll start the introductions before we get started. Starting us off with the discussion will be Dr. Gil Rozman, who's the Musgrave Professor of Sociology Emeritus at Princeton University. He's also the editor-in-chief of the ASEAN Forum, and perhaps most importantly, the editor-in-chief of the Joint U.S.-Korea Academic Studies volume that we're really talking about here today. Gil and I worked on this for a long time, and KEI couldn't have done this without his hard work, and we're really very fortunate to have him working with us on this project every year. He'll be presenting on his paper on Xi Jinping's geopolitical framework for Northeast Asia from the book's first section on the geopolitical frameworks for Northeast Asia, the 5 current leaders. He will also be providing short overviews of each section of the book. Dr. Scott Harold is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. He also teaches at Pardee RAND Graduate School and Columbia University. He's presenting on his paper on the U.S.-China relationship in the second section of the book on how national identities are reshaping bilateral relations in East Asia. And last, certainly not least, is Congressman Charles Boustany. He's a partner at Capital Counsel LLC and a counselor at the National Bureau of Asian Research. He's also a former congressman from Louisiana and a former heart surgeon. He'll be talking about his paper on China's economic rise amid renewed great power competition and America's strategic choices therein, featured in the last section of the book on economic concerns with China's rise and the implications for relations with Beijing. Before I turn things over to Gil to get us started with the discussion, I'll just take a quick second to remind you to send your questions over at any point during the discussion using the Zoom chat function so that we can jump right into the Q&A after the remarks portion of our event is finished. So with that, I'll turn things now to Gil.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you for your important contribution throughout this process. I'm really privileged to have been involved in these books with so many talented authors and for quite a long time. I have to say that if you look back at the whole series of KEI books in the 2010s, you will find a nice sequence. You can compare thinking on geopolitical issues from year to year. It reminds me of what I did in the 2000s when I looked at the National Bureau of Asian Research Strategic Asia books and compared their analysis of China from year to year. And you found that very useful for understanding changing perceptions over time. Well, this series has produced some very interesting results, and I think this year in particular, with regard to China, we have found a lot of interesting conclusions. We try to cover up-to-date material. So much of the material is what's happened during the past 12, 15 months. I want to say that we also give quite a bit of historical background. So I will turn to the chapters of the geopolitics section for a brief introduction before going into more detail on my own coverage. The first chapter was by Mark Tokala, and which he looked at Donald Trump's policy towards East Asia in a historical framework. He analyzed some of the principles behind that. He linked it to previous U.S. presidents and how they approach things. There's a good deal of historical depth here, as well as detail about what President Trump's particular choices have been in dealing with this region. So it's not just an overview of what's happened in Trump's policies over the last year, but it's a background perspective on how we should interpret them. Then another chapter by Dmitry Trenin analyzes Putin's framework for geopolitics in Northeast Asia. He argues that this was not a full pivot to China, more a pivot to Russia in Asia. And he sees a good deal of resilience in Sino-Russian relations, one of the positive assessments of the state of those relations, but he also is cognizant of differences in those relations. Some of them have come out even more clearly in the last month since his chapter was completed. A third chapter is by Yuki Tatsumi on Prime Minister Abe's approach. She says that he is the diplomat in chief. He has tried to put himself in charge, which is very much what we've seen all through Northeast Asia. Every national leader has emphasized a distinctive, personalized approach to diplomacy. In Abe's case, he's been heralded for his successes in earlier years, but he came up against some stiffer problems of late. So he has had distinctive personalized diplomacy with Donald Trump, with Vladimir Putin, with some other leaders such as Modi in India, and particularly lately in a very interesting way with Xi Jinping. But she finds that the policy towards China is being tested. She goes into detail about what he's been doing, but also raises questions whether that will be able to endure, given the changing circumstances over the recent months. And of course, the summit that was supposed to take place at the cherry blossom time did not occur. And finally, there is the chapter by Katie Bato about Moon Jae-in, and he too has been trying to put himself at the center of diplomacy with a great emphasis on North Korea. How can he reshape the regional relationship to North Korea? And she talks about difficulties President Moon has had of late in trying to realize his aspirations. Some of the assumptions he had in 2018 haven't panned out, but we're still in an uncertain period. So those are 4 treatments of the geopolitics frameworks that leaders have been developing. My view is that the dominant framework, the framework that should be sort of tying everything together, is that of Xi Jinping. And I argue that Xi Jinping doesn't just have a framework towards Asia or the Asia-Pacific region, but a specific one towards Northeast Asia. And that we have to understand his policies towards the Korean Peninsula, Japan, Russia, the US presence in this area in a holistic fashion. That this policy has evolved and that it has some continuities with sinocentrism of the imperial era and with Mao's anti-imperialist approach. It doesn't have so many continuities with Deng Xiaoping's lying low approach that many thought would be the source, the legacy that would be carried on in China. I argue that Xi Jinping in 2012, when he came to power, through 2016 had a policy which I call Xi 1.0. And in that approach, he was trying to have steer relations to this region in the following way. He was trying to keep the US engaged, Japan under pressure, Russia in tandem, and North Korea isolated but beholden. So I go through some of his past approaches to these countries. And I also argue that South Korea is kind of a swing country for China, and he wanted to, with ups and downs in South Korean policy during this period, keep South Korea mindful. And then we get some dramatic changes. So 2017, I see as a turning point, both from the point of view of Donald Trump arriving and Kim Jong-un, first getting more belligerent and then turning towards diplomacy. And Xi Jinping also has domestic reasons for making some changes. So I see Xi 2.0 as building steam from 2017, maybe the toughening approach to South Korea in 2016 over THAAD is a precursor to what's going to happen. And Xi 2.0 is more assertive, and in a way it's trying to bring the Belt and Road Initiative, which was part of Xi 1.0 for much of Asia, bring it to Northeast Asia. And so it involves a tougher policy towards the United States, more sort of pressure to keep the United States at bay, more at distance in this region. I see a more assertive policy to South Korea, particularly in the last year or so, disagreeing with South Korea's approach to North Korea, pressuring South Korea in various ways. It's a more assertive approach to India outside of this area. And it's responded to Kim Jong-un with more support, many summits with him, but also some degree of continuity, keeping Kim aware that China is seeking much more from him. Much of this is linked to a goal of sinocentrism in Northeast Asia to try to swing the Korean peninsula using North Korea as a pressure point on South Korea towards a more supportive view of China as the central kingdom. It's more of a mixed approach to Abe. Abe, Japan is seen as having somewhat more leverage, and they're trying, I think she is trying to find some wedge between Japan and the United States, and some more pressure on Putin to go further in integrating Russia with Chinese foreign policy. So just to highlight the last year, which was so important in the coverage here, I see the two events that became quite significant in accelerating Xi Jinping 2.0. The first was the Hanoi summit failure and the realization, which I think was always assumed anyways, that US-North Korea ties would not get very far, and that now China was going to play a bigger role in affecting what would go on, and the trade talks essentially collapsing, although there was a second wind later on in the year. And then she had a variety of summit meetings in June, including with Kim Jong-un, and then in Osaka with various leaders, including with Abe. And then in December, he had some meetings with Moon Jae-in and Abe, and he made more demands, particularly on Moon, for what I would call a fourth no after the three no's from 2017. And he was seeking a fifth document between Japan and and China. So this is my conclusion, and I then wrap it up by saying that she is not going to succeed, for the short term at least, in getting Sinocentric Northeast Asia Kim Jong-un is slow to open the border. Putin is still somewhat cautious. Moon Jae-in still gives his priority to keeping the United States alliance. Abe's support is very conditional. So I see we're still in a testing relationship. And right now we seem to be heading more towards a polarized region rather than towards the Sinocentric framework that Moon is seeking, and she is seeking, I'm sorry. Okay, let me turn now to introduction to part two. I'm really excited by the papers in this part as well. I think national identity studies bring out a great deal about what's going on in this region. And here I see the quality of the papers, each bringing out a different aspect of the region as really far-reaching and worthy of close attention. Rush Doshi's paper on Hindu nationalism and how the discourse in China has evolved and the degree to which nationalism towards China is a priority or not a priority really breaks new ground in my mind. It helps us a great deal in understanding that. Sewon Byun's paper on Chinese views of South Korea has great depth in covering Chinese sources and looking at the evolution of Chinese views. And she concentrates particularly on the alignment of elite and popular views as seen through the internet and elsewhere. Chul-hee Park's paper on South Korean views of Japan, for me, it was an eye-opener because it showed a transformation in the thinking of conservatives in South Korea, a much more polarizing debate on Japan than was occurring just 3 or 4 years ago. And Brad Glasserman's paper, Enough is Enough, on Japan's attitudes towards South Korea, goes into great detail on Japanese thinking and the sort of fed up notion about what they can do with South Korea and how tired they are of this debate. The themes are familiar, but I think the quality is special. So with that, I will move, simply say that Scott Harold's paper is exciting for me too, and I'm so glad that Scott is here to tell us about the bilateral relationship of the United States and China, particularly as seen from the US side. Scott?
Well, thank you, Gil and Kyle. It is an honor and a privilege to work with KEI, and it's always a pleasure to be edited by Gil Rozman, who always has great insights and also always a light touch, which is always appreciated as an author. So it gets you really to the right point of where you need to edit and not over edit. So thank you for that, Gil.
Not always a light touch, I'm sorry.
My remit today is to talk a little bit about national identity and US-China policy. So I'll start out by saying that the paper adopts kind of an international relations theory framework as taught in the United States, and it tries to disentangle national identity from calculations about balance of power, perceptions of threat, or other policy goals countries might be seeking. And of course, that's very, very challenging to do. So one of the first comments I'll make is that it's worthwhile noting that this paper is not explicitly trying to say that everything about US-China policy can be explained with reference to national identity, but rather to make the case that national identity in and of itself is still an important variable, even if it's a challenging one to employ. Some of the challenges that might arise in using this category to explain big change in international relations or even small changes in countries' foreign policy. First, it can be prone to exaggeration. You could simply tie everything to national identity. It can also be prone to cultural or civilizational bias. If you think, well, I know my culture, and so my culture is the best, that's the kind of thing you want to avoid in good analysis. Second, trying to select metrics. Gil, you already mentioned that some of the papers, I think you said in particular, Sewon Byun's paper kind of divides this along the lines of popular opinion versus elite opinion. Very good. But then again, even that can be challenging, right? We don't generally have large numbers of surveys of the general public and elites frequently done over time, repeatedly on questions like, how do you think about China? We do have these occasionally, But in my case, I opted to go with the notion that elite opinion would ultimately, in the United States case at least, as a liberal democracy where elite leaders have to undergo regular elections, tend to reflect, at least at some level, popular opinion. There's also another problem here, though, and that is that national identity is both an independent variable, in other words, it has causal effect by itself, but it is also a dependent variable. In other words, most major theories of international relations that deal with identity now would say that identity can be affected by what happens outside of the country. And we'll talk about that when I get to some of the cases. Also, identity is contested or open to interpretation. So my view of what American national identity is, the glass may look half full. Someone else may say the glass is half empty. Both of those could be fairly accurate interpretations. So it's not to say that anything is an accurate interpretation, but certainly it is a contested field. And then finally, national identity is slow to change in some ways. Whereas international relations and international relationships often change quite quickly. Then again, national identity is not immutable. It does change. And as I'm about to show as I walk through the last 20 years of US-China policy, I think it has shifted somewhat substantially over this period from 2000 to 2020. Over that period, we've seen an increasingly stark normative critique of China in US policy circles, partly as the United States itself has grown, I would argue, more liberal, more inclusive, more willing to address problems in our own history, whether those are past treatment or current treatment of groups that were previously disenfranchised or treated poorly, whether those are women, gays, blacks, what have you, immigrants. But at the same time, China has grown substantially more authoritarian. And an interesting question has been really to grapple with what has been happening the last 3 years. Clearly, the Trump phenomenon, the Make America Great Again, Trumpist critique of the United States, or that interpretation of American national identity, is a much more nationalistic, much narrower definition. At the same time that's been happening, we've had the Me Too movement, we've had Black Lives Matter, we've had base renaming, we've had, in the last 2 weeks, arguments over whether or not it's acceptable in the United States to send federal agents in undercover to make detentions of legal protesters. And so the unusual thing here is that against this backdrop of seemingly rising tensions within the United States, China policy has nonetheless been one of the very few areas where there's been substantial overlap between liberals and conservatives, progressives and white nationalists even. And that is to say that there is something like a liberal I think, in the United States that might suggest, or at least plausibly suggests, why many people in the Trump administration who are more hawkish have received substantial support from many on the liberal or left-leaning side of the political spectrum in the United States who do recognize that a state that has no controls or constraints upon it and that is employing the means of advanced technology to pursue genocide in Xinjiang, to repress people in Hong Kong, to threaten its neighbors, needs to be pushed back against. So with that, Gil, let me jump into kind of the discussion of the 3 eras that the paper looks at. One is the Bush era, one is the Obama era, and then finally the Trump era. And I think it's important to remember that during these 20 years, China is not a static object or an uninvolved actor. It is an actor led by different men, right? So it starts in 2000 with Jiang Zemin at the helm. Hu Jintao takes over in 2002 to 2004 and then rules till 2012. And since that time, we've had Xi Jinping. So China's power has been growing during this period and its actions have grown increasingly aggressive across the 2 decades under discussion here. China was much weaker than the United States in the 1990s and early 2000s. It began making pretty dramatic strides during the 2000s to the early 2010s when the United States was focusing heavily on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. And then over the last, let's say, 8 to 10 years, has really been pursuing this Xi Jinping vision that you outlined very nicely, Gil, of kind of restoring China to its quote unquote rightful place in the international environment, building up the China dream of national rejuvenation and a strong army dream, together with a very advanced technology capability and a very capable economy to bolster that. So during the Bush era, from 2000 to 2008, much of this time, there was a sense that the United States had an insurmountable lead over China. There was still some hope that, in the words of 2005, words of Deputy Secretary of State, of the Deputy Secretary of State, who of course at this moment—
Robert Zoellick.
Robert Zoellick, thank you, Gil. That if China would be willing to do so, the United States would welcome China as a quote unquote responsible stakeholder. This was not a naive assumption that China was just going to naturally become a responsible stakeholder. It was in many ways putting the burden on China to step up to and become a responsible stakeholder, and to try to signal that the United States would be open to partnership or working with China, or not opposing China, or not containing China, if China would abide by the same rules that other countries were abiding by. Throughout the Obama era, I think that there was if you remember, of course, I'd say it would be fair to say that the Obama presidency began on one of the most difficult notes that any American presidency has ever started with an enormous financial crisis, with many companies in or nearing collapse, and the global financial system in dire danger. And so any sense that in 2009, in January, that the number one challenge facing the United States, while it was at war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and those looked like they were losing causes, that the number one thing to do would be to confront China, that did not seem to many observers to be the case. And in fact, there was obviously an early hope that was ultimately not realized, that the United States might be able to induce China to partner with the United States in addressing three core issues. First, global financial rebalancing, save the global economy. Second, address anthropogenic or man-made global warming. And third, address the question or threat or risk of nuclear proliferation, most notably in the cases of North Korea and Iran. I think over the course of the Obama administration, there was enormous frustration, and that's partly what spurred the more articulated version of the pivot or rebalance that the president gave at his speech in Canberra in 2011, that sought to tighten U.S. alliances, reposition U.S. forces to the Indo-Pacific, build in an economic component through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and reinforce regional institutions, norms, and the rule of law. However, by the time of 2017, it was quite clear that the Chinese administration under Xi Jinping was both becoming more assertive or aggressive, and that the Obama administration and the Bush administration prior to that, while trying to improve the U.S. ability to counter China, had not yet found the magic sauce, the secret sauce, if you will, that would change the way China was behaving, and that debates within U.S. politics about what the U.S. national identity was were shifting in dramatic ways. So all of you will remember, I'm sure, how the issue of voter anger in 2016 arose, and with certain consequences for the country. And one of those consequences was that the individuals who came in with President Trump viewed China both as a strategic competitor, an ideological threat, a rival, an adversary, and also framed themselves as kind of representing a strand of American national identity that had previously been sidelined or marginalized, but was the only force capable of addressing or pushing back on China. And so over the course of the last several years, you've seen speeches by Vice President Pence, Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Esper, Attorney General Barr, FBI Director Wray, and Ambassador Sam Brownback, the Ambassador for International Religious Freedom, who have characterized China's actions not primarily in terms, exclusively at least, of their actions, but also in terms of their values. So China is characterized as an existential threat to U.S. global interests, freedom, and the way of life. In fact, just today, Secretary Pompeo has called on the Chinese people to change the way the Chinese Communist Party acts, coming as close, I think, as any American has ever come since the Dulles speeches of the early 1950s to call for regime change in Beijing. That has emphasized, the Trump administration has emphasized the Made in China 2025 program and surveillance technology as being kind of inherently at odds with American liberal values. Xi Jinping's announcement that he would be the president for life, or that they would lift term limits on him. The behavior of imposition of a national security law in terms of violating the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 with respect to Hong Kong, and then, of course, the already mentioned genocide being perpetrated in Xinjiang against the Uyghurs. I think all of these have come together to present China very dramatically as something akin to the other, in some sense like a mirror that reflects the United States back at itself and says, you know, is this what we see? When we see ourselves, we see one thing. When we see China, we see something very, very close to the opposite. And I think finally reinforcing all of that has been something we just touched on because the papers were done in early March, but that was the eruption of the novel coronavirus that came out of China and that Chinese propagandists have claimed was a US biological weapon introduced to China by the United States Army. So just to wrap up, I'll say, you know, national identity alone cannot account for shifts in US policy. Other issues clearly do. Most notably Chinese actions, China's stated ambitions and its growing capabilities. But for the United States, as it thinks about its policy towards China, I think we are increasingly in a world where US national identity will touch on reference points such as we defeated fascism in Hitlerite Germany and Imperial Japan. We stood down Soviet communism and we defeated radical Sunni Islamist terrorism. We can rise to the challenge of Chinese communism. And that's kind of a rallying cry that paints US national identity in a heroic image of standing up for the free world. For the Chinese, and Gil has covered this more, so I'll be brief, but the narrative is one of kind of reunifying a divided nation internally, riven and preyed upon by external foreigners who sought to keep China down, whether that was Europeans in the late 19th century or early 20th century Imperial Japan, and from 1961 onwards, Soviet communism and US hegemonism. I think Xi Jinping's view is that China is now on the cusp of a national rejuvenation, and if this is what a rejuvenated or risen China looks like in the world, then those in the United States who see ideology or national identity and say it's in conflict with China's vision of itself may not be wrong. So thank you again, and I really hope we have a lot of time for questions, Gil. Thank you.
Okay, we move to part 3, and I'll just briefly say we had 4 papers in part 3 dealing with economic concerns with China's rise. That was the theme this year, and Matt Goodman wrote about Japan's strategic ambivalence, its conflicted response economically to China, cooperating with BRI to some degree, but establishing some principles to try to make sure that it was not the kind of BRI that China had earlier been pushing. Then we had a chapter by Yuan Wanho on Chinese innovation and its impact on the Sino-South Korean relationship. Detailed analysis of patents and degree of innovation in one country versus another, and how much it poses a threat to South Korea's own innovation economy. And finally, Kitty Prasirsik wrote about ASEAN views of China's rise. Again, discussing some ambivalence, the acceptance and benefit from China's rise, but also, particularly in the last year, growing concern about some aspects of China's rise. I won't say more about that because now we'll turn to Congressman Boustany and talk about, have him introduce the topic that's on most people's minds right now, and that is Sino-US economic conflict. Charles?
Well, thank you, Gil. And I want to thank you and Kyle and KEI for the honor of being a part of this project. And it's a pleasure to be a part of this panel too. Scott, good to be with you as well. So as I've looked at this topic of the China's economic rise amid what seems to be great power competition that's renewed. I tried to look at what are America's strategic choices in this, based on where we are today and what should we be considering. So to summarize that topic briefly, to leave time for questions, I'll cover 4 areas. One is the notion of renewed great power competition. Secondly, what is the strategic context now and how is it somewhat different than what we've experienced in the past? I'll take a look at US strategy in very basic terms, and then strategic choices. So with regard to great power competition, this didn't happen under the Trump administration. It didn't just suddenly appear. It's been going on for quite some time, although it has accelerated during the past 3 years, and certainly the COVID-19 impact has also been an accelerant. But renewed great power competition is really the result of a coincidence or confluence of a number of developments that have been ongoing. If you go back and look at the great success of the liberal international order that was created after World War II, it has been coming under mounting strain since the 1970s as a result of non-tariff barriers, newer forms of protectionism that are emerging and some even emerging today, and the emergence of foundational technology, all of which require convergence on standards, norms, and rules among market economies. But we're seeing growing divergence among market economies and in this area. And over time, this is creating risk of devolution into an order that's going to be dominated more by economic nationalism, escalation and protectionism, and even heightened security risk. So that's what's been ongoing for quite some time, that is sort of bringing us to the point of where we're seeing renewed great power competition, all within the context of China's rise. Keep in mind the legitimacy of American leadership is tied to this rules-based economic liberal order, and yet China's rise under CCP leadership, with its market size, its commitment to mercantilist Leninist political and economic principles, putting the party first under consideration, and also more recently its assertive challenge to the standards underpinning the order, have really added further acceleration to this divergence that's ongoing. Meanwhile, American foreign policy, and especially American foreign economic policy, has veered sharply toward economic nationalism, further weakening the fabric of consensus that's needed to address all of this. So pivoting to the strategic context, I fell back on some of the classics in international relations from a realist standpoint, and pulling from Hans Morgenthau, in viewing circumstances where persistent differences exist between major powers, precluding consensus on significant issues, the remaining mechanism to reconcile power and peaceful relations ultimately falls back on balance of power. But what's different now? How is this different now than the classic 19th century or early 20th century balance of power type of dynamic? Well, first off, divergence over international rules and norms, along with international institutions that have been ill-equipped to deal with some of these developments, especially to deal with and facilitate consensus, pretends that balance of dynamics will certainly determine distribution of power for the foreseeable future. Likewise, going back historically, economics, economic growth, economic strength, technological innovation are primary determinants of power. And so in this day and age, given the dominance of the economic and technological side of this, as we're seeing played out in the US-China back and forth, the balance of economic power is going to be really one of the major determinants of where the comprehensive balance of power ends up and how power will be distributed. So since this competition is now occurring under circumstances of economic interdependence with diverging consensus, lessening cooperation, but also economic interdependence characterized by very complex global networks of value chains, manufacturing chains, an integrated information technology network with the blurring of civil and military use for technology. It's very important that U.S. strategy take into account that strategic context in building the foundations of strategy. And I submit in my paper that the U.S. must consider focusing on really shaping a favorable balance of economic power in order to be successful in dealing with China. The United States alone will not have the aggregate leverage. Countries will hedge in this sort of fight or competition between the U.S. and China. And this is especially so given that countries are heavily dependent upon the United States in many instances, certainly in the Indo-Pacific region, for our security alliances and the security umbrella that the U.S. provides, but yet they have deep trade and investment relationships with China. And so they're being put into a very difficult situation. In fact, in a number of interviews and discussions I've had over time with officials in these various countries, especially in the Indo-Pacific, they don't want to have to make a difficult choice. And so this is the new type of balance of power dynamic that's at play. In terms of U.S. strategy, if you look at where we started prior to the Trump administration and after the Cold War, U.S. strategy was based on open engagement with China, coupled with balancing using our security alliances. There were high expectations that China would integrate into the economic system with its WTO accession. We would see ongoing economic liberalization and perhaps political liberalization with time. However, in looking back at pretty much, I mean, if you go back all the way to Mao Zedong, but certainly from Deng to Xi, that kind of economic liberalization ultimately was going to be incompatible with the primacy of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the way it governs. So the Trump administration came into office, certainly recognizing the growing frustrations and the current alignment of views that something needed to change with regard to China. I mean, the sequential Pew polling shows that, after the Tiananmen Square incident, what happened was public opinion in the US of China plummeted. And then it had a recovery over time, but it never came back to pre-Tiananmen levels, with the exception of right when the Trump administration took office, and there was the meeting at Mar-a-Lago, and public opinion rose. There was some thought that there would be this new modus operandus and negotiation between Trump and Xi that would lead to improvement in the relationship. But that quickly turned sour in the ensuing time. And now the Trump administration is taking a much firmer approach. This policy toward China can be described in my mind as unilateral escalatory decoupling, but you have to keep in mind it's part of a broader protectionist policy using tariffs, secondary sanctions, and other trade restrictions targeting important market democratic countries, and both in Asia and in Europe. And the impact of that is that we're seeing some impairment of our relationships in the transatlantic relationship, as well as with some of the countries in Asia, as a result of this indiscriminate use of tariffs and other negative tools of economic statecraft. Also, unilateral escalatory decoupling from China without allies will really start to diminish America's legitimacy to lead. It will hasten the rising wave of economic nationalism and potentially harm the position of the United States in a system that is going to be driven by the balance of economic power. This falls back on some of the international relations theory that we've seen put forth by Keohane and others over time. The administration's policy, in my view, and I described this in some detail in the paper, is not consonant with the current strategic context. And furthermore, I think it runs counter to what we need to do to shape the economic balance of power and ultimately the balance of power. So why is all this important? First off, we've looked at this. In my paper, I've described this in some detail. I've done some work with Aaron Friedberg at Princeton that we published, that was published by the National Bureau of Asian Research. What's really needed is aggregated leverage in coordination with allies to truly test the Communist Party's leadership and to see whether they do have an appetite and capacity for reform. While I tend to be skeptical that we can get much in gains because of the strong adherence to a mercantilist Leninist system where the leaders in China are vested in that system, I do believe it's worthwhile to test it further. And it can only be done with aggregated leverage. At the same time, we need to address the vulnerabilities in supply chains and information technology networks. And that needs to be done in combination with allies. For instance, looking at investment screening measures, looking at export controls, these will not be successful ultimately trying to do this unilaterally. It needs to be done in concert with as broad a swath of allies as possible to have true impact. Ultimately, this strategy would basically strengthen the liberal international order with or without China. And I think it's important to understand that because I want to make a distinction between decoupling and something that's done more broadly, which Aaron Friedberg and I have called partial disengagement. Partial disengagement is not a unilateral strategy. It's with allies. It incorporates using trade agreements, positive tools of statecraft to put pressure, but also looking at ways that we can minimize vulnerabilities by coordinating with allies, perhaps even creating a registry to start among allies to weed out bad actors from supply chains and investment opportunities. The strategy ultimately would strengthen the international liberal order with or without China. It would put China in the position of having to make a choice of whether to actually engage in structural reform or select less favorable economic conditions ultimately. Those are the those are the concepts I tried to address in the paper. I urge you to read the paper and be happy to answer any questions going forward. I'll turn it back to you, Kyle.
I would urge everyone to read everyone's paper. I think this was a really fascinating discussion, really great encapsulation of your papers and more. I'm cognizant we're short on time, and it's actually very convenient for me because my questions I wanted to ask you are actually two questions that come from Dagyum Ji at VOA. Obviously, she works on the Korean service there, and I work on the U.S.-Korea relationship at KEI, among other issues relating to Korea. But to bring this conversation to the Korean Peninsula, how can the strained U.S.-Sino relationship impact both North and South Korea? What does the competition mean for South Korea on the one hand and North Korea on the other? And on the North Korea side, Deputy Secretary of State Steve Biegun said that the U.S. and China can still work together to cooperate on North Korea, but is that possible given the broader backdrop of rivalry?
Well, let me have a quick go at that. That's a big, big question. And I can simply say briefly that I think the worsening clash between China and the United States is very difficult, poses a very difficult challenge for South Korea, even for conservatives, but particularly for progressives who want to find a way to get U.S.-Chinese cooperation dealing with North Korea and not to have to side on strategic issues or technological issues with one side or the other. So I think particularly for South Korea, this is the relationship to watch, and how they're changing their approaches to Seoul, happening very quickly, is so important. For North Korea, I think it's, have I just lost you?
No?
All right.
We still see you.
Okay, I just got back. For North Korea, I think it's more complicated. I think they're worried about ending up in a bifurcated system where they have very little leverage and they end up with more pressure for Sinocentrism. But they need China so much that I would say that it gives them some possibilities too, that maybe China will do more for them under these circumstances.
Gil, I'll just add to that if I could. You know, one of the really, I think, important steps that Wei Gyobu and Kyle, I'm sure you're familiar with this, and Gil, probably you too, has taken in the past couple of weeks is to set up a special office in the ROC Ministry of Foreign Affairs for dealing with tensions in the U.S.-China relationship. I think it signals how seriously even the Moon administration takes this. I mean, the Moon administration, I think, has put itself in a very difficult position through its choices of how to relate to North Korea, but it has also been put in a very difficult position by the US administration, particularly the president, with his emphasis on a particular very, very large number for host nation support. And of course, it's also worth remembering that our allies, the Republic of Korea, were under assault by China in a form of economic warfare for several years after their decision to permit the Terminal High Altitude Aerial Defense Battery that defends Busan and the ability of the United States Forces Korea to bring our people into Korea to defend the Republic of Korea and to take people out of Korea if a conflict breaks out. So it's a very difficult situation. It's one that really requires skillful US diplomacy and skillful efforts to try to bring not only Seoul along, but to manage the difficult relationship that currently exists between Seoul and Tokyo, something other authors have written about.
Yeah, this is, in my mind, that's exactly it. This is ground zero for the competition, and the concern being that you have Korea, which is dependent to South Korea, dependent to some degree on its economic relationship with China. They have strong trading relationships, so they potentially held hostage, obviously, as we saw with the missile defense system. But at the same time, the dependence on us for security is critical. And obviously, China is trying to do anything it can to erode security alliances and the security structure that we've put in place. And South Korea is most prone in that whole set of circumstances. I think the U.S. trade agreement with Korea is very important. We need to look at ways we can expand economic cooperation with Korea while continuing to provide the security assurances. And this also makes the case for the US going into CPTPP and bringing South Korea into it as well. I think if the two were to join simultaneously or negotiate simultaneously to join CPTPP, this would create great assurances throughout the region. It would put China on the defensive. On North Korea, I mean, it's a tough problem. I don't think there's any easy solution in the long run. And I don't expect China to cooperate on that.
We have a couple more questions from Dr. Hassan from Oman. And in order to sort of speed things along, I'll ask one of them to Gil and Scott and one to Congressman Boustany. To Gil and Scott, rather straightforwardly, are we witnessing an emergence of a new Cold War between China and the United States? And Congressman Boustany, what are the consequences of unilateral decoupling towards China as you described them?
I would say we are witnessing the emergence of a new Cold War, but there are some very significant differences from the old Cold War. And the indicator that I would use to argue this is the emergence of ideology or identity differences becoming very stark between the two. Just a few years ago, they were not so important.
I'll add to that and say I think I agree with Gil, although in some sense, the Chinese view, I believe, is that what are you talking about new Cold War? The Americans have been trying to engage in peaceful evolution since 1949. And so in that sense, in the sense that the Chinese were a part of the Cold War I don't think they ever thought it went away. After 1989, the means may have changed. The United States was giving assistance to lawyers groups and judges training and human rights groups and whatnot, but the Chinese Communist Party regarded all of those, as shown in document 9, as a threat that sought to subvert the regime. So for China, I believe this is still the same old Cold War. It's for Americans who thought, well, we could coexist, and we could hope that China would gradually evolve in a new direction. For anyone who thinks it's not a new Cold War, I'll just quote the best line from No Country for Old Men. If it's not one, it'll do till a real one arrives.
Well, briefly on the Cold War issue, there's a danger in thinking about this as a Cold War in the old terms, because the paradigm is very different now because of the economic interdependence, technology interdependence, and to bring back this balance of power concept I talked about earlier, we need to view it in those terms to be successful. And that is why unilateral, coercive, or escalatory decoupling will fail. Decoupling means the US is pulling away, and we run the risk of isolating ourselves from allies, and we will not be successful if we do it that way. We need to use positive statecraft with our allies, put together the right kind of diplomatic alliance, and mostly in a way that's not, going back to the old view of the US and its allies trying to contain China or, humiliate China, but use trade policy, trade investment policy as an economic tool of statecraft to create an open architecture system around high standards that China will have to meet. And these standards have to be enforceable. And we need to use that same approach in international organizations where we agree with allies on standards and not let China with other authoritarian entities set standards, especially for technology. And then finally, in the context of working in these international institutions, we need to develop a reform agenda and a common approach to China and other non-market economies. So economics needs to be incorporated into the broader security framework, and it should be equal with it if we're going to be successful. That's why decoupling itself, a unilateral American posture, is doomed to fail in this strategic context.
I completely agree with you, Congressman Boustany. All too often we see the economic side of things sort of get swept under the rug, but it's so important, especially with our relationship with China. I know we're almost out of time, but I'm hoping you all can indulge me in one last question. This is such a fascinating conversation. And we talked a little bit about, the papers are written pre-March, pre-COVID. So we didn't really get so much. We talked a little bit about them in the papers, but not as much as I'm sure we will talk about them next year's volume. And I'm wondering, looking forward, some of the events that happened in the past couple of weeks that are also potential game changers, potentially having a major outsized impact on the US-China relationship. And I'm talking, of course, now about the Hong Kong national security law. And now how, in your opinions, how it's still early days in seeing how this is being implemented, but how important is this new development in the US-China relationship, and how could you see this playing out?
I'll take a stab at it. I think it is early to see how it's going to be implemented, but it is a worrisome development. I think the way the US reacts to it has to be under strong consideration as well, because it will have a big economic impact felt around the world. But this is just another front, I believe, in the broad competition that's ongoing. And I think the US needs to move back from taking tactical approaches to China, reacting to China, and we need a broad strategic framework in which to put all this in to truly address the challenge. And that's sort of what I tried to tackle in this paper I put together, and I think others are doing the same. But I think the common theme underlying all of this is a need for a new strategy that meets the strategic context.
Scott, you want to go second?
Sure. I mean, I think, Kyle, you've put your finger on it. You know, we're seeing actions taken not exclusively by Beijing, but certainly important actions taken by Beijing that, to use kind of classic IR theory of constructivism, these are iterated over time that are shaping the identity of the United States and its impression of the other. And in this case, let's say it again, China is perpetrating genocide in Xinjiang. There is no doubt about that at this point. It doesn't look, just like Congressman Boustany said, Cold War II, if that's what this is, doesn't look exactly like Cold War I. Genocide in Xinjiang doesn't look like armed guys on horseback in Sudan, and it doesn't look exactly like Jews and gypsies pushed onto trains in Europe. Oh, except when it does, when we see images of Uyghurs with their heads shaved and their arms bound behind their back pushed onto trains in Xinjiang. So there's elements to this that are pretty strong and that are really shaping, I think, for in a very long-lasting way, U.S. policymakers' impressions of what they're dealing with when they're dealing with the Chinese Communist Party. It is never going to be, the case that you could say, well, we know with 100% certitude that China can never be anything but a genocidal, war-seeking regime. But on the other hand, they happen to be doing that now. And so in that sense, it's pretty difficult to see how you get back to something that looks like, well, we've got our differences, but we'll cooperate on this. I'm not very optimistic in that regard.
Well, I would conclude by saying I think the book does begin to cover the COVID-19 impact. There is some coverage in most of the chapters, so we didn't miss it altogether. But my own impression is that what has happened this year is an acceleration rather than some kind of great change in the way things are going. I also think in 2008, 2009, we got mostly an acceleration of problems that weren't well perceived beforehand. But both the responses to the pandemic and the US much more aggressive approach towards China, and especially China's assertive handling of a number of issues, have brought us much closer to the Cold War outcome that was pretty well anticipated, and makes it much more imperative, as the congressman said, that there be a broad strategic response rather than a knee-jerk response to what is happening.
This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation, and obviously we're not able to solve all of all the issues in the U.S.-China relationship, both in the book and in this webinar. So I'm really looking forward to future research by you all moving forward on different aspects of the U.S.-China relationship. I know you've stuck around with us for a couple of extra minutes, and I hope you don't mind if you stick around with us with one more. Junie, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the slide. I just wanted to bring to your attention that we have an event coming up on July 28th as part of our conversation series from 2 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. on the ethics of sanctions on North Korea with Hazel Smith. Hazel Smith is one of the world's foremost experts on North Korean food security. So if you're any at all interested in the conversations that we had here today, I would highly encourage you to join us then. And once again, thank you all for coming. Congressman Boustany, Gil, Scott, great comments, fantastic. Great to work with you, and I'm really looking forward to working with you again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle.